This video is for Unit 1, Lesson 2, Constructing Bisectors for Common Core Region Geometry. The skills you'll learn in this lesson will be to construct a perpendicular bisector of a segment and an angle bisector. This first video will be to go over the vocabulary terms. The next video will cover the perpendicular bisector, and the video after that will cover the angle bisector, so that you can watch 3 separate videos depending on which part of the lesson you need to review. So let's start off with the first vocabulary term. For each of the 4 vocabulary terms below, please make an index card so that you can use that for review for any tests, quizzes, or further geometry regions at the end of the year. So the first term we're going to talk about is the perpendicular lines, which are lines or segments that form 90-degree or right angles. The symbol is marked on a diagram if it's 90 degree by this little box symbol right here. This symbol that you'll see if it's communicated, which means perpendicular, is this upside down T symbol. And for example, if we wanted to communicate line U is perpendicular to line T, we would put the perpendicular symbol in there. Remember from yesterday that we can label a line with a lowercase letter rather than points that fall on the line. Our next term is perpendicular bisector. That is a line or segment that divides another segment into 2 congruent halves. So in this example, CD is the perpendicular. Is the perpendicular bisector. It's not letting me write. Hold on a second. There we go. Perpendicular bisector. And AB is the segment that is being divided into 2 congruent parts. Notice on AB we have 2 congruency marks that indicate that AD is the same distance as DB. We also have the little box to indicate that CD is intersecting ADB or AB at a right angle. And additionally, the bisector passes through what we call the midpoint, which is your next vocabulary term. So there is where your midpoint will be. And so we know that since CD has divided AB into 2 congruent parts, that AD is congruent to DB. Right? And what's it for that? So a midpoint is a point that divides a segment into 2 congruent halves. This you can also think of as the middle point. Right? They kind of just chopped off the last part of middle to create the term midpoint. So what does a midpoint do? The midpoint is a point that divides a segment into 2 congruent halves rather than a line or a segment that does so. So if this whole segment is 22, let's say, that means from A to M will be 11, and from M to B will also be 11, because M is a midpoint and it divides it into 2 congruent parts. So the perpendicular bisector crosses the midpoint of a segment at right angles. Right? We can't bisect a line. A line is an infinite figure, so there's no way to establish exactly where half of that line is. Our last term and the last construction that you'll learn in this lesson is angle bisector. This is a ray, it could be a segment or a line, that also bisects an angle into 2 congruent halves. So notice down here again we have the little congruency markings to indicate that these 2 halves of the angle are congruent. BD is the angle bisector. Right, BD is the bisector of angle ABC. So that means that this would be 40 and this would be 40 if this entire angle, that was terrible. Let's try that again. Oh, it undid all of it. If all of this is 80. Okay, so if the whole angle is 80, the bisector will cut it into 2 congruent parts.